Today's webinar is going to be on your first 100 days, controlling costs. Now, bearing in mind the time we have for this webinar, there may be areas that I do not cover, but feel free to, as James said, ask questions, or if there's anything you want me to go over in subsequent webinars, I'll be more than happy to do so. So all your suggestions are very welcome. Okay, so you've just got into a new role as CFO or someone responsible for spend, and one of your prime areas of focus will be cost control. So what is cost control? So cost control is the practice of identifying and reducing business expenses to increase profits. When you're starting your organization, I think you should start from the top in terms of understanding what your organization's strategy is. What's their competitive advantage? There's a model here which is being developed by Michael Porter, and it ultimately says that there are two strategies for any business. Either as a business you can be a low-cost business, so as far as your customers see you, your lowest cost, and that's why they come to you for that value of being the lowest cost. Or you can be an organization which is differentiated from all your other competitors, and your customers see value in your organization because of the difference you offer than your competitors. So differences could include superior quality, they could include superior customer service, or even safety for that matter. Your organization is known for being safety conscious, and that's where your customers differentiate you from your competitors, and that's why they come to you. Now, the reason I talk about this is, in terms of when you want to engage in cost control, you have to recognize your strategy, because what you don't want to do is have your cost control strategy affecting your organization strategy. So let's take differentiation, for example. If your business is known for high quality products, high quality services, safety critical, if you start cost control and reducing expenses in direct spend in terms of materials and services that provide your final service, then you're potentially cutting a bit too close to the bone. So what may happen is you cut costs so much that actually that differentiation competitive advantage that you have gets eaten away, because the materials, the services that you're now buying in terms of inputs are less quality than what your customers expect. So you may find that your cost control strategy actually affects the ability of your organization to maintain its competitive advantage. So, particular focus should be made where your organization sets to differentiate itself through quality, services, and being safety critical. And when you start cutting or cost controlling in those areas in terms of direct procurements, inputs that support that quality or support that customer services, you have to be very careful what you cut, and make sure you don't actually affect the quality that your customers get. If your strategy is a low-cost strategy, then arguably it's more simpler. You're trying to cut costs across the board in order to maintain that competitive advantage that your customers expect from you. So today, what we're going to really try and focus on more is the indirect spend. In other words, not direct spend, which potentially, if you cut costs too much, can affect your ability to sell to your customers. The next area I think is worth considering is stakeholder engagement. I've posed a question here, which is cost control going to be done to your stakeholders, or is it going to be done with your stakeholders? I think that's a very important question to ask, because ultimately, in my opinion, you want your stakeholders to be working with you in your drive to control costs. Now, I've identified a number of different stakeholders, such as management. Obviously, management can supply you with a lot of data regarding spend, and that can help you identify areas that you can target in terms of maybe you have excessive spend with one particular supplier. Staff, if you join an organization, obviously there's staff already there. They have a significant amount of knowledge and intelligence around processes that are currently going on in the organization. Being able to get staff members on side, key staff members in particular, on side, can actually save you a lot of time in terms of accessing valuable information in terms of processes that are currently going on, and identifying areas that you can streamline processes in order to reduce costs. If you don't have staff on side, if staff feel that you're carrying out cost cutting to them, you won't get easy access to that knowledge. You'll have to find it out yourself, and potentially that will take a lot longer. Same with suppliers. Speaking to suppliers, talking to them about your need to control costs can mean that they can actually offer suggestions in terms of different options than what you're currently buying from them that can still meet your requirements. Again, having that collaborative approach to your stakeholders will allow that to happen. And finally, your customers. You need to find out, you may not speak to your customers, but at least speak to marketing and find out, what do your customers expect from you? A bit like what I was just talking about in terms of strategy. What do your customers expect from you? And do your products and services meet that exact expectation? Or do they go beyond that expectation? And arguably you're wasting expenditure on over-specifying in terms of your services and products, when actually you can cut back on some of your specifications and still meet the expectations of your customers. So I think it's very important to engage in stakeholder management very early on, to collaborate with stakeholders, get them on side. In terms of your own skill set, it does mean you're going to need to build rapport with stakeholders, to get them on side, explain what your plan is, explain that it's not threatening, but obviously there's a business need to have this carried out. And you'll find that obviously that will create less resistance and more support for your endeavors, and save time in terms of accessing information and identifying the root areas of cost control within the business. Another sort of aspect I think we should consider is also setting realistic expectations. I don't think it's wise of me to talk about, oh, you can cut costs here, you can cut costs here, without recognizing what's actually going on currently globally. There are a lot of economic headwinds that we are facing for a number of different reasons, such as political, energy prices are going up, which are obviously having a knock-on effect on other industries. The US Fed has talked about, members of the policy committee have talked about, potential interest rate increases, same in the UK as well. That's obviously going to have a knock-on effect in terms of, your suppliers, if they have high, debts and their repayments have to go up, that potentially has an effect on their ability to supply you. Tax rises as well, employment shortages. I was just reading earlier that in the US, I think it's 1.6 million vacancies will be unfulfilled or unfilled in the US because of long COVID. So it's one of the things that's sort of starting to emerge. Long COVID is actually making people not unable to work, and that's affecting the ability of employers to the tune of 1.6 million vacancies. So with staff shortages, it potentially means we're going to have to pay staff more to attract them. Same with our suppliers, they're going to have to pay staff more to attract them, which obviously means the costs go up. And finally, supply chain distribution. So, disruption. There's a lot of disruption that's going on in the supply chain at the moment globally, from shipping to air freight and so on. In the UK, I'm not sure if it's happening in the US, but in the UK, there's been a shortage in HGV drivers, which has meant that trucking of goods from point A to point B has been delayed, and that's had a knock-on effect on supply chain, on supply available. So I think all in all, what that means is that as an organization, your ability to control costs and reduce expenses may be challenged by the macroeconomic environment that we're currently facing. And I'll even go as far as to say that one of the, maybe even a bigger priority will be to make sure that you have adequate supply of goods and services to meet your customers' demand as and when they need them. Because due to the severe disruption in the supply chains, employment and so on, lack of employment or employment shortages, it's actually a struggle to meet your customers' demand. There are a lot of organizations that have complained that they can't fill vacancies and therefore they can't meet their customers' demand. So rather than thinking about cost control, actually in this period, it may be just to hold fort and make sure that you can keep delivering at the same standard and quantity as required from your customers. And maybe at this point, just ensure that you have adequate, or you implement adequate cost control structures, so that when the economic situations gets better, you have such structures and processes in place that you're able to start generating larger cost savings than you potentially are currently able to do. So what we're going to talk about are areas in terms of processes and structures that you can bed in your organization. So when the economic climate gets better, you're well positioned to actually take advantage of those cost savings. Budget variances. Those of you who are, have come from an accounting background will be very familiar with, comparisons between what's budgeted and the actual costs, particularly adverse variances, and ultimately finding out, why are the actual costs a lot more than the budgeted costs. I've posed here a number of different areas that could happen. So material usage, that can happen as a result of defective work, from staff members, or it can be that staff members are using too much of a particular material to carry out a particular job or make a particular product. So for example, a cleaning company, someone working as a cleaner may use too much cleaning liquid per room, which means that ultimately you're going through a lot more material. So these getting to the root cause of that can start allowing you to find out areas to control costs. Same materials price. It could be that your materials are priced highly because you've had to make emergency orders. Why have you had to make emergency orders? Because the approval process took too long, for example, or because there was insufficient planning in terms of knowing when you needed to make a particular order. So all those things can potentially be tightened up, which mean that you don't have to order, you can order well in advance and potentially get discounts in that respect. And you don't, expose yourself to having to make emergency orders. Labor operational efficiency, we've just talked about, the pandemic and the staff shortages that mean that, potentially, filling key roles at work may be difficult. And, that may be a reason for the cost. So it's really about what mitigation strategy you put in place to, if there is a member of staff that can't come in, how can you quickly find a replacement to make sure that your operations continue? And finally, labor, right? During the pandemic, there was a big push to, make redundancies to align your business with the demand, because demand, in some industries had dropped due to lockdown. But now what you're finding is that businesses are struggling to rehire now that demand has started to go up again. So one needs to be careful about looking to cut in terms of, making redundancies, particularly if it's due to something like the pandemic, to make sure that when demand goes up, you do have sufficient staff to, to take up the slack in terms of the increased demand. Okay, so things you can actually do. One of the key areas is obviously promote competition. So you may have existing suppliers you've used for a number of years. Why not, throw some competition in there, run an RFQ, assuming there's sufficient suppliers in the market for that particular category that you can identify, run an RFQ, and arguably you can get lower prices. There's an argument that there's an example I should say here of, for example, you're currently purchasing printing paper for $30, and you purchase 1,000 cases. That equals $30,000. You run an RFQ, and potentially you can save 6.6%, which means that annually you're saving $2,000 a year. So for running RFQs, requests for quotations, putting certain categories of spend that you haven't checked the market for a long time to the market in terms of competition, you can generate cost savings in that area. Another area you can generate cost savings is in terms of consolidation of specifications. Now, depending on how large the organization is, you may have different parts of the organizations buying the same product, but with different specifications from different suppliers. So consolidating that into one specification that allows you to buy, to raise the volume you're buying, because you're bringing together all the different departments requirement for that product into one single requirement. That gives you higher quantity, and therefore you can get economies of scale. So consolidation of specifications across the board, making sure there's no sort of, if you like, duplications of specifications, can also potentially lead to cost savings as well. Supply optimization is another one. So essentially, if for the same product you have 10 different suppliers, arguably that's difficult to manage in terms of sending out purchase orders, managing deliveries, and so on. So why not minimize the number of suppliers that you use to buy a particular product or service? And that makes it easier to manage, again, from a purchase order processing point of view, and in terms of managing their performance. So supplier optimization is another way in you can save costs by reducing your management time and cost in managing those suppliers. Negotiation for cost avoidance and savings is another way in which you can manage or control cost. So we've got an example here. For example, you're currently paying $10,000 for a cloud service yearly. The subscription is up for renewal, and within the contract, the cloud service provider has an increment of 10% every renewal of the contract embedded in the contract. So without you knowing, all of a sudden the following month you're paying 10% extra. So identifying those contracts that are up for renewal and making sure, for example, there are no automatic increments within the contract, and also actually going out to negotiate with that subscription or service provider to say, look, you've got a 10% increment in your contract. When we renew it, how about we renew the contract for longer in return for waiving the 10% increment. Now, again, it's a negotiation, and it's about finding where there's common ground for an agreement to be made. Another thing that can be introduced in terms of contracts is service credits. Now, service credits act as if you like, a deterrent for poor performance. And a service credit in the contract will state that in the event the supplier fails to deliver on time, there will be, let's say, a 5% deduction from the next invoice made. So poor performance leads to a deduction from the invoice or from the next invoice. That does two things. First of all, it helps control costs for poor performance. Second of all, it encourages suppliers to not have to have service credits against them, and encourages good performance. Streamlining the procurement process is another option. Now, again, a number of organizations have a wide range of different procurement processes. Ultimately, what we're saying here is you can reduce the time spent in processing purchase orders by automation. There's a statistic from the American Productivity and Quality Center that says manual purchase order processing can cost up to $506 per purchase order, which is a considerable amount. If you automate that system, not only do you streamline the approval process, but you also save a significant amount of cost. So by switching to automation, that too is a way you can control costs. A number of other benefits that we'll come on to in terms of controlling spend as well. Having an automated procurement process allows you to categorize specifications. I talked earlier about having duplicate specifications from different departments and different users. By having a one centralized automation system, you can harmonize the specifications. So if anyone wants gloves, for example, they can click on the glove category, and that one specification will be there, and they can order against that specification. So it minimizes duplication, and again, saves cost. In addition to that, your vendors and so on can be stored on the database, and that makes it easy to retrieve and contact vendors or suppliers when you need to contact them. And also there's a mechanism by which vendors can update their contact details. So at no point will you have to get in touch with a vendor and find that that's not their number or their email address has changed. Improved spend visibility, we've talked about. Consolidating purchase orders. It may be that you send out a number of different purchase orders to the same company in a month. Potentially by consolidating the purchase order into one purchase order at the end of the month may mean that you go over that minimum quantity threshold that attracts discounts. So again, by having that visibility across the number of purchase orders sent, consolidating those purchase orders, that can in turn allow you to trigger discounts based on the volume that you're ordering from that one purchase order that you weren't able to attract from having, a number of different purchase orders for smaller volumes. As I said, it streamlines the approval process, even to the extent of, managers being able to approve when they're not in the office. Saves time and speeds up the process. I talked earlier about potentially having to make emergency orders because approvals come late. That's avoided by having an automated system where relevant staff members can approve whatever location there is, whether they're in the office, whether they're at home, whatever the case may be. It also, having an automated process also allows to eliminate errors. So there's potentially big cost control or cost savings to be made in terms of duplicate spend or double billing, and also in terms of incorrect charges. The automated system allows for that visibility for you to see where that's potentially occurring, and for you to be able to stop it from happening. Maverick spending. There may be some other phrases for this, but maverick spending is identified where someone buys from a supplier that is not under contract, or someone buys from a supplier without following the procurement process, the laid down organizational procurement process. So if you like, they're buying rogue, as it were. So maverick spend typically, and as I said, we're talking about members of staff making purchases outside the normal laid down purchasing procedures. Typically, maverick spend can account for up to 80% of a company's spend, and that's from the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, which potentially means that the organization is missing out, or I say yes, the organization, but through acts of individuals buying outside the purchasing process, the organization is missing out on pre-negotiated preferred supplier discounts that may have already been agreed. And there's a quote here from the Hackett Group that says, some organizations report that up to 16% losses come from, not going through the correct procurement procedure. So if you think about that, if you have $1 million company, or $1 million spend, I should say, 80%, 800,000, 16, potentially there's 16% of $800,000 worth of savings by ensuring that you eliminate maverick spend. You can eliminate maverick spend through a number of ways. First of all, it's to train and to educate all staff members, not just procurement staff, all staff members, about the need to follow laid down procurement practices and the benefits of doing that in terms of the organization's cost savings, and the dangers of not following procurement processes within the organization. You can also, obviously, by having an automated system, ensure that all purchases go through the purchasing system and eliminate spend that do not have purchase orders, or, as I said earlier, also avoid duplication. Another final way you can manage maverick spend is to, through the automated system, have approval controls that will limit a particular budget or budget holder's spend. And that's how you can control and prevent maverick spending, but also through the use of purchasing cards. So giving, relevant staff member purchasing cards, that means they can, spend on that purchasing card, but within the purchasing card, there are limits. I worked with a client who had purchasing card for their delivery drivers. And this purchasing card could only work at petrol stations or gas stations, and you could only buy petrol with that purchasing card. You couldn't, buy a bag of crisps or chips or chocolate bars or anything for the petrol station. You could only buy petrol. So, and there are potential limits to the amount of petrol you can buy at any one time. So through purchasing cards, that too can limit spend, particularly when, for example, drivers are out of the office premises. Inventory management. So those of you who have a large inventory, be that direct stock or indirect stock, MROs, or maintenance, repairs, operations, potentially you can manage the inventory in such a way that you reduce working capital and you avoid obsolete and redundant stock. Yeah, one of the key ways you can do that is being able to forecast demand. Now, it's not an exact science. There are various ways you can do it, primarily relying on historical purchases that your organization has made, or in terms of customers have made from your organization. By tracking historical purchases that have been made, you can extrapolate and potentially predict what your customers' purchasing patterns are going forward. Once you understand your customers' purchasing patterns going forward, you can start aligning your inputs, your suppliers of goods and services, to match as and when your demand is forecasted for. The benefit of that is that it means that you don't have too much stock at any one time. You move towards, if you like, a just-in-time approach. That said, just-in-time in the current climate is quite risky with all the disruption, so bear that in mind. Also, in terms of how you monitor your stock levels. Now, there are different methods. There's a fixed order quantity way of reviewing stock, which essentially says every month we order a new batch of stock, irrespective of whether the stock that you currently have has gone down to the extent that you need to order new stock. So it just continually orders stock every month. Now that works for fast moving supplies. But where you have slow moving supplies, essentially what you have is, excessive stock being ordered and potentially obsolescence of stock, redundancy of stock, which obviously drops the value of the stock. So probably for slower moving stock, and you need to identify stock that is slower moving within your organization. As I said, it could be indirect, it could be direct stock. You need to start thinking about doing a periodic review of stock. So every month before you make that order, you check what the stock levels are of that slow moving stock and decide whether or not to reorder. That prevents having, excessive stock and, excessive money tied up in working capital. And, in terms of storage space and so on, the costs associated with that, and insurance, transportation, those are all, costs associated with that as well. Options you could use, vendor management inventory, or vendor managed inventory, I should say. And vendor managed inventory essentially allows the vendor to manage when you need new inventory or when you need more stock. So they have visibility of your current stock levels. And because they know their lead times better than you do, they can decide on the right time to make that order for you. So you don't need to actually make a request. They will do it on your behalf. So in terms of processing, inventory processing and sending out purchase orders, that's minimized because your vendor, having visibility of your stock levels, can actually just go ahead and restock based on your falling stock levels of a particular stock item. There's also consignment stock, which if you're in the retail sector, means that you can acquire stock from your vendor and only pay for it when that stock has been purchased by your customer. So that again will help your cash flow position. I think again, a word of caution. Obviously when you move into an organization and you want to make an impression, beware of making short-term decisions to satisfy that expectation, which potentially have longer-term costs. The impact of risk to operations. So as I said yesterday, not yesterday, as I said earlier in the webinar, when you're dealing with suppliers, yes, we all want lowest possible price from suppliers, but sometimes the price we're driving for may be a bit too good to be true. I've had instances with clients where they have negotiated with vendors, got a really good price, and the supplier said, yeah, we can do that, sign the contract. A few months later, supplier comes back and says, we need a price variation. The price of everything's gone up, et cetera, we need to review the price. And my client said, well, hang on, when we signed the contract, surely you knew about these prices. And the vendor said, yeah, we did actually. We did know about the prices, but you weren't ready to listen to the fact, what we were trying to tell you about the price. You wanted that price. So we said, yeah. And ultimately what they were saying is we knew that once you signed the contract, we would lock you into that contract. And then by the time we come to review the price, your negotiation position would be, limited, and therefore you'd have to increase that price. So, trying to reduce your prices to such an extent that are not sustainable will, in the long run, come back to haunt you from a cost position. Also, as I said earlier, the impact on quality, especially your direct inputs. Just to be clear, your direct inputs are goods and services that ultimately your customer will see. So if you're making, I don't know, if you're making widgets, for example, any suppliers that go into making those widgets, your customer will see them. If you start cutting back on quality because you're trying to reduce price or you're trying to control your cost, ultimately that will feed into what your customer gets. And if your customer starts getting what they perceive as lesser quality to what they're used to from you, you potentially will lose that customer. So be careful about, cutting, particularly on direct costs, cutting too close to the bone, because ultimately that can harm your sales. Training is another area. It's a very obvious area that, someone coming in and think, right, we suspend training, etc. I would suggest to you that, the training allows for cost savings in terms of less supervision needed. You can allow staff who are skilled and understand what they're doing to get on with it without having to supervise, which has a cost, which may not be very visible, but it is there, the cost of supervision. And also in terms of being able to identify cost savings in their workflows. You know, if they're trained and understand what their work should be like, they're a lot able to start identifying, you know, what can be cut in order to make cost savings in terms of helping you make cost savings. So these are reasons why, you know, targeted, appropriate training should be kept. Also in terms of staff retention, as I said earlier, there is, you know, an employment shortage, and retaining staff is very important, and training is one aspect of that. I've talked earlier about staff redundancies and also morale. Ultimately, you know, it goes back to my original question, which is, are you doing cost control to your stakeholders, to your staff, or are you doing it with them? It's important that you recognize that you're doing it with them, and they recognize that you're doing it with them, so that morale stays high. People are, if you like, promoting the cost control policy across the organization and helping you to obviously achieve it organization-wide. And that is it. So thank you very much. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. My name is Dikibo at telso.co.uk. We can also discuss more mid to long-term strategies in the areas of collaboration with suppliers, things like outsourcing and so on, which I have done a webinar. I think I did a webinar last month. Please feel free to watch the webinar on outsourcing last month, which talks about, you know, how you can go about outsourcing and ultimately save costs through using third-party vendors. Thank you very much.